Thanks, first of all, to David. Thanks to STATSports for the opportunity. Thanks to everyone at home listening. Um, Obviously, this presentation probably won't be as science-based or research-based as some of the previous presentations that have been, but it'll be a practical insight into it, what we do day to day and then week to week as well. So just an outline of what we'll cover today, or in the next 40 minutes or so. The first two sections will give a lot of context around what we do. So we have a pretty unique environment here in that we're sort of flirting between that semi-pro and professional environment. Second two sections will be a bit more of an insight into what we do day to day. And then the last section will just be some of the reflections I've had over the last two and a half years or that have been here in this role. So just the Hong Kong Elite Rugby program, this is basically the professional platform in Hong Kong. So it commenced in 2015, and this is a quote from the CEO at the time. So the ERP, which is the Elite Rugby program, is designed to further strengthen our domestic leagues, which will also enhance the standard of our national team. So it's very much a top-down, bottom-up approach in terms of developing rugby in Hong Kong. There's two distinct periods, and with the different periods, there are different challenges that each pose. So during the domestic season, so overall we'd have about 35 players. All players would play domestically for a club in Hong Kong, and most of the players would be eligible to play for the national team, if not in the next year or two that they become eligible. So during the domestic season, players would train full-time with us, but they'd also train twice a week with their clubs, mostly on a Tuesday and Thursday night, and then they'd play a game at the weekend. So in those 3 sessions, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, we actually wouldn't have any control over what they do. So it's very much a management type situation where we have to try and balance what they're doing with their clubs versus what they're doing with us during the week. Then the other period would be our international period, or global rapid rugby. So global rapid rugby is basically an Asian Pacific competition. It started last year, and this was supposed to be the first full year of it, but obviously with the coronavirus, it didn't really go to plan. This is where we would have full control over players. So we train very much like a club team, maybe a provincial team in Ireland, or a Super 15 rugby team, where we'd have full control over the players. We train Tuesday, Thursday, and then game Saturday, or if not, a training session on Saturday as well. And then just in terms of my involvement, so this is essentially my first role outside of my undergraduate. So listening to the 3 boys, Davey and Paul especially, talking about their background, I feel a bit out of my depth, but I started here as an intern in 2016, and then 2017 is when I started this role. And then more recently, I've been assigned to work with some of the other teams within the Hong Kong Rugby Union, aside from the Elite Rugby program. So it might be men's and women's, or under 20s programs as well. So in terms of just what we do, so this is so we talk a lot about reverse engineering, and I love reverse. I think it's the right thing to do. So working back from the game. So this is an image based on product engineering, and it sort of highlights the reverse engineering cycle. However, it's not necessarily specific to sports preparation. So if we were to change some of the terminology, and this would sort of fit in with what we do to prepare for a game. So the first thing, if we start with performance, first thing is we assess our game demands, and that can be done through GPS or through stats analysis, performance analysis, or even just through looking at the game. We assess the athlete's status objectively and subjectively, And then from then we can identify strengths and weaknesses and prioritize work-ons that we need for both for the individual and then for the team as well. That's half the battle. The next battle is putting all that together into a training program. So plan out long-term, short-term, medium, and in between that as well. And then it ultimately ends up with our training sessions and then modifications that we make. Where GPS fits in, first step, assessing game demands is a big help in terms of knowing the physical demands of a game. And then we go back to step 8, so modification, so based off training. Ultimately, with a training program, the foundations are the individual training sessions. So we have to constantly evaluate, are we actually training what we want to train? And GPS is a massive tool in helping us do that. A lot of steps there, but it comes down to 2 things. What qualities, from a physical, technical, tactical, and mental standpoint, do we need to perform? And then how do we get there? So looking at what quality, performance is the aim. So we break performance down. So we try and quantify as many aspects of performance as we can. So whether that's stats or looking at game demands, and I'll go through that a bit later on. So that would be assessing game demands, and then we assess the athlete status. Again, like I said, through subjective and objective measures, we can quantify certain aspects of performance. The game is the ultimate test, but sometimes it's difficult to put a number on a player's performance in the game, and that's why it's not always looked upon favorably. But ultimately, the game is the ultimate test. Are they performing? And then that requires some honest conversations among your coach and staff to evaluate. From then, we can identify strengths and weaknesses and work-ons, and then we try and put that together into a plan. So as always, all plans are written in pencil. So we start with the macro, so it might be over a season. We generally work on a season base, but then we have our quadrennial sort of plan as well, which for our national team, we're working from World Cup to World Cup. Macro into a meso, so we plan out different phases within the year. Within the phases, we plan the weeks, so essentially a microcycle. And then within the microcycle, we plan the sessions. And then the session needs to fill into the micro plan, micro into the meso, and then meso into the macro. So it's kind of working up and down the chain as we go. Only once we've done all that, then the actual fun stuff starts. So we can actually begin training. And as I said before, we're constantly monitoring and evaluating what we're doing to make sure that we're getting the effects that we want. So in terms of my role, so that was a bit of a background into how we as a group would sort of go about things. In terms of my role, I have a lot of input with the coaches in terms of coach education, and definitely my favorite part of the role is working with coaches to try and identify performance solutions to problems that we're having, whether it's programming or whether it's trying to get more out of a specific drill or within a specific session. So I spent time at Altus last December, learning from Dan Paff, Stu McMillan, and a few others. And this isn't a direct quote, but one thing that Dan Paff said, and it really resonated with me. So understanding is needed for intelligent conversation between key stakeholders. So a strength and conditioning coach with no awareness of the sport they're involved in, if they're talking to a coach who has no understanding of physiology or sports science or strength and conditioning, then those two will end up working in silos, and that is absolutely what we don't want. We want to try and have an integrated approach to try and improve performance. Ultimately, there's only one question, when we're talking about testing, there's only one question that matters, and that's our players performing the way coaches want them to. So it's kind of a 3-layered approach in the feedback we deliver to coaches. There's the 40,000 foot view, which is looking at the week as a whole. Then you're looking at the sessions which make up a week. So for us, it would be Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday if there's no game. And then what I'll talk about a bit after is the drills within a session. So for now, I'm just going to talk about the individual sessions. So I'll just highlight that in red. So everything, so the warm-up is all taken out. So we're trying to just compare our session, our full session, to game demands. So in terms of volume, so this would be typical game demands based on, so this year's preparation was based on last year's competition. So very much like sales, you base this year's purchases off last year's sales. We base this year's preparation off last year's performances. And our volume philosophy in terms of what our volume target is roughly within a week, sometimes it's a bit over, sometimes a bit under, is 1+1. So what that means is we play a game on the weekend if it's a game week. So we've 1 game load on a Saturday, and then during the week we want to total 1 game load as well. So we're essentially trying to aim 2 times a game load over a training week if there's no game. The importance of that, so that's not a term I coined, that came from our coaches. So the importance of developing a common language with the coaches is really important for developing understanding. So then you're speaking the same language, and it's easy to communicate over and back. So what we have are session classifications, and these are not good or bad. So green is not a good session, red is not a bad session. It's just to highlight the differences in sessions. And what this was originally done for our rehab, return to play, so that for players returning to play, they could put stuff into game context, or the rehab coach could put the players' sessions into game context and then build from there. So less than 50% of game load would be considered a green session, amber 50 to 75, and then over 75% of a game load in terms of volume would be considered a red session. Again, not good or bad, just what they are. So this was actually presented as it is. It was presented exactly as it is to our coaches, just to help with the understanding. So this was presented on a Friday in the lead up to a Saturday session. So we looked at our Tuesday, our Thursday, and then to evaluate where we're at. So if we look here on our Tuesday session, so the first row of data, Tuesday on the 18th of February, our total distance was 5,600, and comparing that to our total distance of a game, our total distance was 6,200. So we're essentially, that Tuesday night session was essentially 90% of game load in terms of total distance. And the same can be said for high speed running, and accelerations were a bit higher. On Thursday then, very similar in terms of total distance. High speed running was down a little bit. It would be classified as an amber session, and accelerations were actually identical. So just there, Tuesday night above 75% game load for total distance, high speed running and accelerations. Thursday night above 75% game load for total distance and accelerations, and then amber session for high speed running. So this is really simple, but sometimes simple is good, just to help coaches develop their understanding. And this isn't something that we always do, but this is just something every now and again we just it almost acts as a bit of coach education, just so that they can develop their understanding as to why we're doing what we're doing, and then we can have better conversation. That's ultimately the aim. So better understanding on both parts leads to better conversation. So the weekly total so far across total distance and high speed running was roughly 1 + 0.6, and our target is again, roughly, but it's about 1+1. In terms of intensity, so we're looking more at the density of exposures across sessions. So our philosophy is 130%. So we want to try and train at least 130% of a game load. Again, this is a coaching term. So our head coach, he came back from Japan, and he estimated that Japan were training and playing 30% higher than what we are. And so in Asia, like, Japan would be the top team and Hong Kong would be second. So his philosophy then was, we want to try and increase our training by 30%. So that's where that 130% comes out of. Again, we have our session classifications. So a low intensity session is less than 30% game intensity, and then red intensity for us is over 100%. Obviously, we're still trying to get to that 130%. In the middle, then there's two ways to looking at the intensity in the middle. If you're looking at Charlie Francis method, training in that middle zone is too heavy to allow for recovery, but it's too light to stimulate adaptation. And I get that to a point, but training in that middle zone sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes it could be that place where players develop confidence and clarity. So being aware that GPS is not the answer to everything, having that understanding that's just a part. So when we talk about physical, technical, tactical and mental, GPS only measures the physical. And if an aspect of training is not necessarily really high intensity from a physical point of view, it could challenge technically and tactically, which might ultimately lead to performance gains. And ultimately the aim, as we said, are players performing in the way that we want them to. So again, we did the same thing with the same week, looking at weekly volume and then this week intensity. So looking at the Tuesday session, again, comparing this Tuesday session versus game demands. So we trained from total distance point, from meters per minute point of view, we were training at 78% of our game intensity, which is nowhere near the 130%. It's not even in the red. High speed running was actually very similar in terms percentage wise, so 73%, and acceleration 109, so above 100%. So it's classified as red, but still not hitting that 130% target. Thursday was actually very similar in terms of amber session for meters per minute and high speed meters per minute, and then red session for accelerations. So Tuesday night, as I just said, amber session for meters per minute, high speed meters per minute, over red session for accelerations per minute, and then Thursday was the same. So then the week total so far, again, for accelerations, it's over 100 meters per minute, or it's over 100%. For our other two metrics, it's about 70% on average. So across everything, I've just used three metrics. You can use whatever metrics you want or specific to your program. You might use HML, you might use sprint meters. It really doesn't matter. It's just to paint a picture of how we communicate this to coaches to help develop their understanding. So I spoke about our 40,000 foot view of a week. So I went through each session individually there, and now we're just going to talk about this. This slide was actually presented to coaches as well, and using the information that I showed them, I asked them the question. So we've gone through, we've looked at our Tuesday session, we've looked at the Thursday session. How does that lead to a Saturday session, or what information does that tell us? And based on the information that and I made a point to make sure that they tell me this rather than me suggesting. So this was what they come up with. So on Saturday's session, we need a green volume session, but we're high intensity. So not necessarily a lot of time on the pitch, but everything that we do is pretty high intensity. In terms of looking at the green, so why don't we just have a target and say high intensity? That's what we're aiming all the time. It sort of touches on what Owen Tarrant said about looking at his low intensity days. For us, we have installations, and I think they're pretty common in rugby, and they might be termed walkthroughs or something like that. But we have an installation session, and that's the session we want to keep low intensity. So for this session, our volume was 1,500, just over 1,000 meters, and comparing that to total distance of our game average. So then that's 17%, which is in the green. Intensity the same, it was pretty low intensity, which is good, exactly what we want. So it was below 50% game volume for total distance, high speed running and accelerations, and the same can be said for intensity. And that's just a guide to give the coaches, so gives a target for what we want from a high intensity, but also from a low intensity or a low load session. So then it comes to, so I spoke about evaluating the sessions and how that feeds into evaluating the week. Then it comes to evaluating drills within a session. So rather than looking at the entire training block, we're looking at the specific drills or games involved in that training block. So we have sort of two different tables to compare with. It's very much based around worst case scenario. So if we're doing a specific worst case scenario drill, it might be for 1 minute, it might be for 2 minutes, it could be anything up to 5 minutes. We are looking to compare that exactly to worst case scenario data from a game. Now, I've just shown here worst case scenario data for 1, 2, and 3 minutes. You can be as specific as you want. And across as many different metrics as you want to compare it as accurately as you can. You could even you could even calculate worst case scenario data up to 15 minutes, depending on what your typical training drill or worst case scenario drill length is. For drills that we don't use worst case scenario, or for non-worst case scenario drills, they're just typical drills where we still want a high intensity, but it's not necessarily looking at worst case scenario. There's a heavy technical emphasis or whatever it is. We look to compare to 80% of worst case scenario. So this, again, there's no real science behind this. This is actually something I took from Bob McCunn when I went down to Brisbane last July, and I spoke with him on one afternoon, and he presented this idea to me, and I thought it was pretty good in that it's not really scientifically based, but it's just it gives us a target to try and hit within our drill. So that would be how we compare worst case and non-worst case in the individual drills. Across then, so that was looking at our kind of our week to week work, looking at the three different viewpoints. This is more looking back over the last 2.5 years, and some we do all of it today, but it's been a building process into what we've brought in. So the first thing, the acute to chronic ratio, where are the limitations? The biggest thing for us was that it enhanced coach diligence. It just created a bit more awareness around coaches when they're planning both sessions, but then weeks and then training periods, that, you know, keeping training pretty consistent reduces that risk of spiking. Again, it's not a predictor of injury risk, but it's a tool to enhance coach awareness. It actually worked out pretty well in that Tim Gavitt came to present. He presented maybe 4 workshops over 2 days back in August 2017. So I just started my role. So it was good for him to present that, and then I sort of built on that momentum with the coaches, and then we started implementing this type of stuff. That's from a load management point of view. The next thing then is kind of load management. It's more weekly monitoring. So this is I sort of just blanked out the names. So this is just a sheet that our head of performance, head physio, and head of ERP would get, and they'd meet weekly on a Monday, and it just provides all the data that they need to discuss from a strength and conditioning or a sports science point of view. Obviously, a physio will have their medical information on a separate document, but it's just it doesn't make any decisions for the staff, but it supports the decision-making process, in that all the information is there and starts conversation among the staff, and then ultimately it can start a conversation between staff and player as well. In terms of our drill reports, so this is pretty basic in that it's just a table, and we've just highlighted when players have hit their targets based off 80% worst case scenario. I have trialed it with different graphs and different data visualization streams, but simple works as well. Tables work just as well, and coaches prefer this just in our environment, not necessarily in every single environment, but just in our one. Coaches actually prefer the table, so then they can look at the actual data as well. Max speed exposure, so we send this out every Monday, so based on the previous week. So it's just a graph showing what max speed players have hit and relative intensity as well. So Davey and Paul spoke a lot about the different intensities, what to try and hit. We try and hit above 90% at least once a week. And then this is a good graph to just show us, are we hitting those intensities. It's also a good learning curve, so I just blanked out the names at the bottom. In terms, because our players are playing, they train with us, and especially during the club season, they're actually training away from us. We give all players GPS bibs, and we ask them to take their GPS units to club training, and then bring them back, and then we can track their loads that they're doing at club training, and then for club games as well. Obviously, with that, giving players responsibility of a GPS bib and GPS unit, sometimes they might forget or whatever else, might not bring it for whatever reason. We've always implemented fines, and for some people, the fines have worked, but for one player in particular, he was notorious for not bringing his GPS bib, and no amount of fines could encourage him to do that. Once we started with this, he was determined to prove that he was the fastest on the team. So he said, he came up to me after I first showed or sent this out. He came up to me and he smiled and said, I'm going to bring my GPS bib from now on. So it's just an indication in terms of, you don't always have to motivate through fear. You can motivate through positive encouragement as well. And then our last thing, so touching on motivating through positivity or positive encouragement. This is a graph that we just showed to the players on the week before their first game of GRR this year. So we just wanted to highlight the intensities, or again, density of exposure that players have been training at, and comparing that to the games. So if we look at this green dotted line, that is the intensity of competition last year. And as I said, last year's last year's sales, identify this year's purchases. So we had a 3-week 3-week period before leading into our first game. So in that first week, we were training at game intensity last year. In that second week, we were training at 120% of our game intensity last year. And in week 3, so the week before our first game, we had nearly doubled our training density or training intensity in terms of high speed running. And I've done the same for acceleration. I presented accelerations back to the players as well. And the graph was a similar shape. One thing to highlight, so I didn't present this part to the players, but in week 2, we implemented, or we had one MAS block throughout the whole week. So I think it was on the Tuesday night, we had a 3-minute MAS block, and that helped improve the intensity of the week above game intensity. And then the following week, we had 2 MAS blocks totaling 6 minutes. So that helped to increase the intensity. Now, I'm not saying MAS blocks are vital to your training program. If you, for example, some teams might be able to train at a much higher intensity on their game because their players are skilled to do so. I'm just highlighting the benefits of supplementing high speed running or supplementing conditioning into your training program. Fully aware that when you're looking at the physical, technical, tactical, and mental, an MAS block only trains the physical. There's no element of decision making or tactical awareness development in it at all. But it can just help in a situation like this where you're not quite reaching the physical demands of what your targets are. So that was just sort of going through what I've done over the last 2.5 years in terms of some of the work that we've done, and then this is just some of the reflections. So this is Eddie Jones. He did an interview in the Training Ground Guru podcast. It was episode 10. I think it was released in January. And like, I've taken a lot from episodes or podcasts with sports scientists, strength and conditioning coaches, physios, heads of performance. I've taken so much in terms of different ideas that we can implement. But one thing I actually really love to listen to is listening to coaches and listening to their perception of sports science and data and stuff like that, just to help sort of with the developing that understanding. So from coach to sports scientist, but also from my point of view, sports scientist to the coach, so I can then understand. So he was asked a question on the future of sports science, where do you think it's heading? And his response was, the amount of information out there will be enormous. The skill of the coach is to understand what's really important and what really makes a difference, and then how you can transfer that information so that the players can understand it. We're all coaches, so whether our job title is a sports scientist or a physio or whatever else, we're all communicating information to someone else, whether it's a player, whether it's a coach, whether it's to another member of the sports staff. So we all need to develop our coaching skills to understand what's important and then transfer that information across. He was then asked a question on, like, so obviously because the amount of information is increasing all the time, he was then asked about the balance between data, technology, and intuition. And his response was, it's definitely a combination of the two, and that's where experienced coaches are important. You see it in football now, the number of coaches that coach up until their 50s and 60s, because they've accumulated all this experience, all this intuition, and they're able to work out what's important and what's not. And ultimately, that's the human intuition element is never going to go away. So when we talk about, so I mentioned it a bit briefly in before around testing, we can quantify certain aspects of performance, but ultimately, for an evaluation of a player, it's always going to come down to a combination of data that we collect, but also human intuition. We can quantify certain aspects of performance, but we can't quantify performance as a whole, or the transfer from those aspects of performance into performance as a whole. So what I mean by that, for example, we can quantify, if we take the example that Davey and Paul spoke about in terms of acceleration, we can quantify a player's acceleration, but we can't quantify how that will transfer. We have transfer into match day performance. We have to work as a whole together to try and enhance the player's application in a specific situation. A couple of questions that I continually, again, there's no real, I'm not trying to make a point here or anything, but like, it's just a couple of questions that I continually ask myself. So we use GPS to determine how much work a player has done. A player can do a little bit of work and have a good game, and then the opposite is true also. So when we get a GPS report, it's just numbers. The GPS report doesn't come back and say this player is lazy or this player is active or inefficient, or it is. And then I just showing a tweet here that I came across over a year ago now, but it's really interesting, really hits the spot in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So our role in evaluating the quality of data, weighing its importance, interpreting and providing context is critical. So if you listen to Tom Allen's presentation a few weeks ago, he spoke exactly about this. Data will never solve problems. It's always the people linking the data to solutions that do. And then just touching on what I just said, the numbers have no way of speaking for themselves. We speak for them, so we imbue them with meaning. So again, a player is not lazy because the number is hit a target. Sometimes we have to evaluate, we have to question ourselves. Did we give the player that opportunity to hit the target that we expect of them? And it required a bit of honest conversations. At all stages, we want to be data informed rather than data driven. So if our GPS data starts dictating what we do within a week, or certainly what we do within a session, etc., then we have a case of the tail wagging the dog, which is never ideal. It's really useful information, but again, it comes down to the context and how it's interpreted, and the people using that data and information, how good it is at making things work. So we can use GPS to establish the demands of the game, like I showed. This can aid training prescription, and that we're training for a specific game. And then important to always ask, so this is something I always ask, are we preparing for the game, or for the game we are playing, or are we simply working hard? Now there's nothing wrong with working hard, and it's actually pretty important in professional sport where it's so competitive now, but at all times you want to try and work hard smartly. Final thing for me then, if there's one thing non-S&C related that I could recommend, it would be this TED Talk, and it might stimulate some more watching more videos on YouTube. It's from Russell Acuff, around systems thinking. And he makes three really good, it's only 12 minutes long, but he makes three really good points in the video. One point is, if we have a system of improvement that's directed at improving the parts separately, you can be absolutely sure that the performance of the whole will not be improved. And applying this to sports science or to sports performance, the obvious connection would be to use it to apply it to the physical, technical, tactical and mental side of things. if we just improve the physical performance, we improve the performance potential in that he has a greater capacity to do more work, but that doesn't necessarily he becomes a better player. So sort of touching on that, we talk about, we're looking at the support staff now, and I've divided into head coach, assistant coaches, S&C and medical. That's probably an oversimplification of the support staff. But if we rely on tests, for example, we want to see, we're looking at injuries. That's our evaluation of the medical staff. We look at strength testing. That's our evaluation of the strength staff. Like if we go down that route, then we're encouraging people to work in silos. What we need to do, keep in mind all the time, is our player and team support. So that's our aim. Our aim as a group is to improve performance of the players on the field for the game that we want. And if we start looking closely, if we disregard that question and start looking closely at individual or separate measures of performance, then that leads to us working in silos when we're trying to be integrated or interactive in our decision making process. That's it for me. So next to none of the ideas that I presented in the last whatever amount of time came from me. So I've reached out and I've spoken to a lot of really good practitioners over the past 2.5 years. Good practitioners, but also really good people in that they've been generous with their time just to sit down with me and talk through things. Definitely not perfect, but if anyone wants to reach out, my contact details are there. Again, thanks to STATSports for the opportunity, and yeah, any questions, fire away.
That's great, Jordan. No, thank you for your time. Much appreciated. Providing great insight there into a combination of sports science and the coaching team. Some really great analogies there. I really like the one about last year's sales allows for this year's purchases. Couple questions here now as well, so if you can hang around.
Yeah.
First one here is just to do with those, that department interaction between the different departments you have there. From a drill design point of view, what does that look like? What does the process look like, both on the pitch itself and off? I know I understand most of it probably will be done off, but is there any kind of manipulations you take?
Yeah.
Yourself?
Yeah, it's really good. So ultimately it comes down to communication. So that's where the understanding fits in well. Once everyone has a bit more understanding or a clear understanding of what everyone is looking for, then the conversation becomes better. So it's literally just sitting down either side of a table and discussing, okay, the sport coach discussing what does he want from a technical and tactical point of view, and he might design a drill. And then a suggestion that I might make is, can he make the pitch bigger and get the same effect, or can he make the pitch smaller and get the same effect? So that, depending on our day, so whether it's an extensive or an intensive day, if it's intensive, then we're looking more at accelerations, change of direction type stuff. Then a smaller pitch would suit us better there. So it really comes down to communication, and communication takes the time. So you need to take time to actually sit down with coaches and then discuss. And then sometimes it works the other way as well. So, for example, I was doing a speed warm-up, and towards the end of it, then we were looking at more some just 10-15 meter sprints. But then the sport coach or the rugby coach came over and he decided to add a ball into it. So it's then becoming more game specific in that players were forced to try and maintain their technical skills at a high speed rather than just simply running fast. And that wasn't actually discussed beforehand, but like I like to look at it, and it's important that we keep the main thing all the time. So in this instance, the main thing is there's their ability to play rugby. So it worked out well, and it didn't compromise what I want to get out of the drill.
Sure. Another one coming in here as well about players outside of your environment or outside of your control. That can be an issue you kind of can face with regards to the national setup and the domestic competition you have. How best do you try and manage that? I know communication is obviously going to be key between the different stakeholders from the clubs and the national team itself. How do you guys address that? Possible, any possible issues, or what have you come across today?
Yeah, so I suppose we're pretty lucky in that nearly all the domestic coaches are involved some way in the national program, maybe as assistant coach or a skills coach that they come in. So the communication between the national setup and the domestic setup is quite regular. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that we can just decide what the domestic teams are doing. Ultimately, each coach can decide what to do themselves. So a lot of it is around management. So the players, we track them, GPS units, etc., and then we try and plan our national. This is in the domestic season. We try and plan our national loading around what they're doing at the club. We try, as the other side to it is, we try as little as possible to compromise performance on a Saturday. So players train Tuesday, Thursday night. We try typically to front load the week, and that makes sense. We don't want to do our heaviest session closest to the game. So if we're Thursday during the domestic season for us is pretty light, but our Tuesday session would be our big session of the week, and that's as far away from the game as possible. So sort of two things. It comes down to two things, and just management. So just thinking about what each party wants, and then communication in that. Communication between the domestic coaches and then the national setup as well.
Lovely. One last one, and then just with regards to, let's say, the performance analysis point of view in the Hong Kong rugby setup, is there any interaction there between the physical and what you see optically?
Can you repeat that question again?
Sorry, just with regards to performance analysis at Hong Kong rugby.
Okay.
And physical the outputs that you're receiving with the GPS, is there any interaction with regards to drill design or session plans combining both the physical and the optical data to bring a bit of kind of context to that work?
Yeah, so in terms of combining, so when we plan a session, like it's not just the GPS data that's taken into account, so that we want X amount of high speed meet. Like obviously the coaches need to get what they want as well to prepare the team technically, tactically, and prepare players on the whole. In terms of overlaying the GPS data on top of the video, that's really useful. It's not something that we've done, but hopefully in the near future with the new Sonorous software, hopefully we'll be able to do that a bit more. So it just gives a bit more context to the physical data that we collect. So yeah, in terms of session designs, absolutely, like we don't just plan from a physical point of view. It has to be, you have to absolutely include the technical and tactical aspects that you need for team performance.
Sure, as you're going to allude to there, the data again, it can be numbers on a sheet, but at the end of the day, you want it to mean something to the coach so he can implement his program how he sees fit. Jordan, thank you very much. Again, much appreciated for you. That was super. Wishing you all the best in as things begin to alleviate up there as well. And yeah, talk soon.
Thank you.
Cheers.